The BEF, after a wretched winter in the trenches, was in no state to support a French offensive until the early spring of 1915. However, knowing that the War Council in London was considering operations in the Dardanelles and Balkans, its senior commanders feared that unless the BEF made a positive contribution soon, resources might be diverted from the Western Front. By mid-February, a plan was approved for an attack by Haig's First Army on a narrow 2,000-yard front in Flanders. The plan was simple. The aim was to eliminate the German salient around Neuve-Chapelle and threaten Lille, an important road and rail junction. Photographic reconnaissance by the Royal Flying Corps facilitated the production and distribution of detailed trench maps and enabled the assaulting units to rehearse the initial phase of the attack. For the first time, precise artillery timetables were issued, and every gun that could be spared was sent to the front to counter the German artillery. The artillery was limited to a 35-minute Hurricane bombardment, following which fire would be lifted from the enemy front trenches and a barrage laid sewn to impede German reinforcements. On 10 March, the day of the assault, the surprised German defenders were numbed by the intense bombardment. That was an achievement rarely to be repeated. Their wire had been extensively cut, their emplacements destroyed. The attacking brigades of the Indian Corps and Rawlinson's IV Corps swiftly took the front trenches. Within 20 minutes, a breach of 1,600 yards had been opened in the German line. The makings of a victory had been won. Unfortunately, delays on the flanks caused congestion in the center, and the German strongpoints also held up the advance, robbing the attack of its impetus. The BEF and Indian troops had seized the German defenses on a frontage of 4,000 yards, penetrated to a maximum depth of 1,200 yards. Their advance captured Neuve-Chapelle and flattened the salient west of the village. But in the end, they could not exploit their early gains. Haig suspended the attack on 12 March after suffering 13,000 casualties. The BEF was now taken seriously as an attacking force. Neuve-Chapelle also highlighted several intrinsic problems of trench assaults. Careful preparations would generally help attackers break the enemy position, but it was much harder to move artillery and reserves forward quickly enough to break out of these defenses before enemy reinforcements arrived. However, the effectiveness of the short Hurricane bombardment was one lesson which the BEF, to its cost, largely ignored or discounted over the next 2 years. Before the Allies could launch their next defensive operations, the Germans, employing poison gas for the first time on the Western Front, attacked the northern flank of the Ypres salient. The gas was chlorine, which kills by causing the lungs to produce fluids in which the victim drowns. The salient was important to both sides, but because Falkenhayn still accorded priority to the Eastern Front, the use of gas at Ypres was largely experimental. Just after 5 p.m. on 22 April, following a short but ferocious bombardment, the Germans released clouds of chlorine gas from 5,730 cylinders. With no protection against the gas, French divisions retreated in panic, opening a 5-mile gap to the left of the 1st Canadian Division's positions. Langemarck and Pilkem fell, and at dusk, the Germans were only 2 miles from Ypres. Fortunately for the Allies, the German troops were unwilling to pursue the gas too closely and, lacking reserves, failed to grasp their sole opportunity to effect a breakthrough in the west that year. During the night, a new defensive line was patched together by the British and Canadians. When a second gas attack came at Saint-Julien on 24 April, the Canadians, using towels, bandages, and handkerchiefs soaked in urine or water as improvised respirators, courageously prevented further erosion of the front. This was now a war of chemicals and engineering. Various assaults by the BEF between 23 and 26 April, made with inadequate artillery support and negligible French assistance, failed to regain lost ground. On 27 April, painfully aware that German gunners could now shell the salient from the left and rear, General Smith-Dorrien urged withdrawal to a more defensible GHQ line to the east of Poche and Wiltshire and within 2,000 yards of the Ypres. This suggestion was rejected by the mercurial Sir John French, who was in an optimistic mood following a promise of extra divisions from Foch. With his doubts about Smith-Dorrien reawakened, French immediately transferred responsibility for all British troops around Ypres to the 5 Corps commander, Herbert Plummer. This incident precipitated Smith-Dorrien's resignation, and he was succeeded in command of 2nd Army by Plummer on 6 May. In May, the Germans made 4 more gas attacks, seizing additional ground on the Bellewaerde and Friesenberg ridges. When the battle ended on 25 May, the Ypres salient, now less than 3 miles deep, assumed the basic form it would keep for the next 2 years. For the second time in 7 months, the BEF had halted a German drive on Ypres. This latest defense had cost another 58,000 casualties, compared with the nearly 38,000 lost by the Germans. Now, with the Germans positioned on 3 sides and holding the key ridges to the east and south, there was no relief from the enemy guns and no foreseeable end to the suffering of the BEF. The first spring of the World War brought fresh hopes to the armies on all fronts. The reality of trench warfare had buried the old hopes of quick glory. The plans of the great powers, the Schlieffen Plan, Plan 17, and the Russian steamroller, were a faint memory of an innocent world passed by. The sobering reality was one of trench warfare. This style of fighting was difficult for generals to adapt to, soldiers to carry out, and disheartening to new recruits. The Germans had firmly fixed themselves on French and Belgian soil and were digging in. They constructed elaborate defensive trenches, which were hardened by the addition of machine guns and barbed wire. The logic being that guns and barbed wire saved men. Men were needed to mount new offensives and conquer more territory. Falkenhayn wanted to use a strike force to push the British off the continent while their numbers were still small. The problem with accomplishing this was that the Germans' ally, Austria, was being pressed further and further back by the Tsar's massive southeastern armies. The Russians were bulldozing the hapless Habsburg army into the Carpathian passes, threatening the dual monarchy's Hungarian homeland. Falkenhayn was forced to delay his offensive against the British and send Otto von Hindenburg 3 newly raised corps. The 3 corps would form a new 10th Army under Colonel General von Eichhorn. The 8th Army under General Otto von Below, reinforced by the 4th New Corps, would form the southern jaw of what was hoped to be a second Tannenberg.
The need for some relief to the Austrians by means of an attack in another spot became imperative. With a heavy heart, I had to make up my mind to employ my only available reserves in the east.
For the relief attack, Falkenhayn chose the Masurian Lakes region, where the Russians still held large pieces of East Prussian forests. The German plan was simple and brutal: outflank the Russians in the north and herd them south into the Augustov forest and destroy them. In January 1915, material and men from von Bülow's 8th Army and Eichhorn's 10th Army lined up opposite the Russian 10th Army. In temperatures below zero and blinding blizzards, the Germans took up their positions. Meanwhile, the Russians were again arguing about priorities. Ivanov cited the failures against the Germans as reason for concentration on Austria-Hungary, arguing that a convincing defeat would prompt Italy and Romania to invade it. With Russia, Italy, and Romania advancing on the dual monarchy, it would collapse, leaving Germany isolated. Ruzsky argued that Germany was the main enemy and force used against Austria-Hungary was wasted. The Grand Duke saw a flank attack from East Prussia as the greatest threat to his planned drive on Berlin and came down on Ruzsky's side, giving Ivanov only 1 extra call and telling him not to attack. The bulk of Russian resources went to form a new 10th Army under General Plehve, deployed south of the 10th, to invade Prussia from the south by passing the Masurian Lakes, while the 10th invaded from the east. Which side would be ready first depended on the railways. Here the Germans won hands down. On 5 February, documents found on a dead German officer told the Russians that East Prussia had been reinforced, but they had no time to act on the information. Their offensive could not begin until 23 February, but the German 8th Army attacked on the 7th and the 10th on the 8th. The weather was atrocious, varying from blizzards to daytime thaws, freezing again at night, so that even though both sides' troops had winter clothing, casualties from frostbite far outnumbered those of battle. Movement of any kind was difficult through snowdrifts and mud. Fast movement impossible, and bringing supplies from railheads took up to 12 horses per cartload. But here too, superior German organization told. By 9 February, most of the Russian artillery was out of ammunition and under constant bombardment. The Russian 10th northern flank crumpled. The Russian army was sent reeling backwards. Once again, as in the Battle of Tannenberg, under the weight of German steel and shells, the lumbering Russian bear was driven into massive retreat. Over the course of a 10-day period, the Russian Muziki stumbled through the unforgiving winter to escape the German pincers, but continuously were forced southward into the Augustov forest, where they were surrounded and captured or killed. By 17 February, the Germans had taken over 60,000 prisoners and had another 70,000 trapped in the Augustov forest. The Germans were now nearing exhaustion, and Russian counterattacks in the last days of February prompted Hindenburg to end the offensive and pull back from the most exposed positions. The Russians had lost 150,000 in prisoners alone and 3/4 of the 10th Army's 396 guns. But the grander aim of forcing Russia to abandon the Vistula line had not been achieved, and the accompanying Austro-Hungarian offensive failed. The Russian public did not know Hindenburg's aim or that he fell short of achieving it. They knew only that another army had been wiped out and that soldiers' letters spoke of overwhelming German artillery bombardment, Russian guns silent for lack of shell, and infantry mowed down or captured by the tens of thousands. In 1914, the Russian Chief of Staff had written to the Minister of War.
The men are saying, why should we perish of hunger and cold, without boots? The artillery is silent, and we are killed like partridges.
While the bravery of the Russian Muziki could compete with the Germans, output of war material could not. Before the outbreak of hostilities, Russia's main trading partner was Germany. Given the state of war, trade was impossible, and Russia suffered mightily for it. The Russian factories were only able to supply artillery divisions with about 1/2 of the 50,000 shells needed per day. Shells which could have saved men for a strike force or rear guard. Prisoners of the Germans lambasted their Cossack liberators.
Who asked you to rescue us? Fools. We don't want to hunger and freeze again.
Despite cold and shortages, the Russian army was still making headway in the south in Galicia. The Tsar's armies continually thrust the Austrians back deeper towards Hungary's eastern border. The last Austrian defense before the open Hungarian plains was the fortress of Przemysl. The Russians had laid siege to the fortress for better than 3 months, starting in the winter of 1915. Przemysl was growing short on food. Cats, dogs, and horses were being slaughtered. The Austrians, sensing the situation, becoming desperate on March 20th, decided to make one last attempt to break out. They failed, and the Russians accepted an Austrian surrender of Przemysl on March 22. In that surrender, the Russians took 107,000 prisoners, 20,000 of them sick and wounded. Austria's military incompetence continued to vex Falkenhayn.
The appeals of the Austrians for assistance never ceased. Symptoms of disintegration became more and more evident in formations of Czech and Southern Slav recruits.
Again, the Germans had to come to the aid of the decrepit Habsburg Empire against the Russians. More importantly, they had to forestall Italian and Romanian intervention. Falkenhayn opted to overawe them by crippling Russia's offensive power. He planned a surprise attack on the Russian Third Army over a 78-mile front between Tarnów in the north and the Lubka Pass in the south. Its focal point was the city of Gorlice Tarnów. Field Marshal August von Mackensen, one of the heroes of the Battle of Tannenberg, was selected to lead the charge. He was given command of the German 11th Army and the Austrian 4th Army. To aid Mackensen in this goal was the familiar howitzer battering ram. As May 1915 opened along the Russian front, the Central Powers had amassed some 170,000 men and over 1,000 guns. The Germans struck on 2 May and achieved almost complete surprise. From 6 to 10 in the morning, the howitzer battering rams smashed Russian defenses to pieces. Then the lightning attack went in. A German soldier recalled.
Neither fire, nor trenches, nor barbed wire could stop the assault, although our ranks became thinner and thinner. After 35 minutes, and despite the tropical heat, we reached the enemy. The Russians clung ferociously to their trenches, but in another 10 minutes, the job was finished.
Mackensen signaled the Kaiser.
I report to your Majesty that the order to make the enemy's positions in the Carpathians untenable has been carried out. The enemy is in retreat along the whole line.
By 3 May, Gorlice had been taken and a 12-mile hole ripped in Radko-Dmitriev's line. 3 of the divisions broke and fled. The rest were down to an average of only 1,000 men by evening on 4 May. The only option for the battered Russian army was to withdraw behind the Vistula. By 10 May, Radko-Dmitriev reported that the Third Army had bled to death. On 25 May, Italy did indeed declare war, and the Austrians began leaving for the Italian front on 3 June, with the Germans taking their place against the Russians. By the 1st of June, Mackensen's troops marched triumphantly back into the fortress of Przemysl. The fortress had been in Russian possession for only 2 months. The Russian retreat was total and immense along the Galician line. By now, Russian losses were soaring. In May alone, the Southwest Front lost 412,000 killed, wounded, or captured. To those that had withstood the howitzer battering ram and the lightning attack of Mackensen's army, it was a miracle to be alive. In the prison camps, the Russians reveled as they believed their struggle against German steel was finally over. Without the Germans, the Austrians could not achieve victory against the Russians. But fighting alongside and with German leadership, the Austro-Hungarian army was able to retake the captured fortress of Przemysl and recapture the 4th largest city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Lemberg. The Central Powers looked unstoppable in the east. For Falkenhayn and his general staff, the real question was how to exploit the series of Central Power victories. As the bulk of Russian troops were surrounding a salient around Warsaw, Falkenhayn saw his chance to encircle from the north and the south and take Warsaw. The bitter fighting defending Warsaw briefly gave hope to the Russian masses, but eventually the city fell on August 5. The defeats at Gorlice Tarnów, Lemberg, and especially Warsaw were more devastating than the Battle of Tannenberg. 15 divisions completely wiped out and 20 more reduced to skeletons. The situation was growing worse by the day. The Russian chief of staff reported to the French ambassador.
In several infantry regiments, at least 1/3 of the men had no rifle. These poor devils had to wait patiently under a shower of shrapnel until their comrades fell before their eyes and they could pick up their arms.
One Russian commander lamented, "Our army is drowning in its own blood." Falkenhayn, recognizing the dire situation facing the Tsar's army, took the opportunity to put out peace overtures to the Tsar. But they were rejected. The situation on the Russian home front continued to deteriorate.
Disorders in Moscow had been particularly serious. The agitation assumed such a scale that it had become necessary to suppress it by force. On the famous Red Square, the mob insulted the royal family, demanded that the Empress should be incarcerated in a convent and the Emperor deposed.
The Tsar, autocrat to the end, paid no attention. In September, he took personal control of the army, saying,
"We shall fulfill our sacred duty to defend our country to the last. We will not dishonor the Russian land."
And so the bloodletting continued. The German armies under von Hindenburg broke out in the north and pressed deep into the Russian heartland. Cities like Brest-Litovsk, Kovno, and Bialystok fell to the juggernaut of an army. The Russians could do nothing to stop them. A giddy Kaiser wrote,
"My victorious sword has crushed the Russians. Woe to them that yet draw the sword against me."
The expedition into the Russian heartland brought an already suffering population even more hardships. The agony of the empire was hitting closer and closer to home. The losses in men were an appalling 2 million. Not even the vast Russian Empire could keep up with losses like these. The largest army in Europe was on the brink of total collapse. The suffering Russians could only wonder, where are our allies? As the Russian lines continued to melt in front of the hot steel of German artillery, the conquest of the Balkans by the Central Powers was beginning in the fall of 1915. The Serbians begged for Allied help as the howitzer battering ram lined up against their northern border to rain shells down on the Serb defenses. But sending help to the landlocked country in the heart of the Balkan Mountains was going to be more difficult than first thought. The best way to help Serbia looked to be through her southerly neighbor, Greece. Greek Premier Venizelos agreed to allow 150,000 British and French troops to land at Salonika and mobilized his own army to come to Serbia's aid. Salonika was chosen because of its excellent natural harbor, its many railroads that led north, and its distance of only 50 miles from the Serbian border. The 1st Division of French troops landed at Salonika on October 5. However, that very day, Premier Venizelos was dismissed by King Constantine. The monarch, whose brother-in-law was Kaiser Wilhelm II, also announced that Greece would remain neutral and not assist the Serbs. A British division was moved from Gallipoli to follow the French. The situation was strange and difficult for the Allies to reconcile. On 5 October, the Austrians and Germans began shelling the Serbian defenses. Then, the Central Power troops crossed south over the Danube and Sava rivers. The next day, Belgrade came under attack, and the British naval gunners fought to the end as the capital fell on the 9th after savage street fighting, costing the Austrians 7,000 casualties. On October 11, Serbia's neighbor to the east, Bulgaria, flanked the Serbians' right and thus entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. The battles between Serbia and Bulgaria displayed the very worst peasant and soldier had to offer. The bitter fighting was a result of cherished mutual hatred. The Serbs were able to score a couple of small victories against the Bulgarians in the east and the Austrians in the west, but the breaking point was the north, where the Serbs were unable to stop the advancing German 11th Army. When the Bulgarians eventually captured the southern region of Macedonia in late October, the Serbians were forced to stage a fighting retreat southwest through Albania. An English naval officer observed the retreat.
Here was no orderly march of troops. They crawled at snail's pace, staggering, bent to the ground, supporting themselves on sticks. Many were without cap or boots, and their clothes hung on them in rags. Some who were too weak to walk alone were helped along by friends. Many were dying of sheer hunger, exposure, fatigue, and the last stages of dysentery. Here and there was a huddled heap upon the ground, the body of some lad too weak to walk further, who'd turned aside to die. The haunting thing was that their faces were all exactly alike. Starvation had reduced them all to the same mask of pain.
Following the army's retreat, was that of the civilian population, who feared reprisals from bitter Austrian and Bulgarian armies. As 1915 drew to a close, 1/6 of Serbia's population had been killed. 100,000 of her 400,000-man army were all that was left standing. As Mitrovica and Pristina fell on 23 November, the surviving 200,000 Serbian troops faced a nightmare march over mountains in the grip of winter to safety on the Adriatic coast. The Serbian rear guard was overwhelmed on the White Drin River, losing masses of precious supplies in the process as the retreat went on in dreadful winter. The only help the Allies could give to the survivors was to ferry the displaced Serbs from Albania across the Adriatic to the island of Corfu. The fall of Serbia was emblematic of the difficult year that was 1915 for the Allies. The Central Powers were running amok in the east and on the Balkan Peninsula, not to mention the ground still occupied in France and Belgium. As Joffre convened a Supreme Allied meeting in early December 1915, a plan was devised to attack the Central Powers on 3 fronts, the Russian, Italian, and Franco-British simultaneously. The attack was designed so as not to allow the enemy to bring up reserves. As 1915 drew to a close, things looked bleak for the Allies, but with a new year brings new hope. Hope for the displaced people feeling the pressure of global war. Hope for victorious battles. Events on the Eastern Front made the projected Allied spring offensive in Artois even more significant as a means of giving indirect help to the Russians. Joffre and Foch proposed that in Artois, after a prodigious 6-day preliminary bombardment by 1,252 guns, the French 10th Army would assault Vimy Ridge to open the way for an advance into the Doual Plain. When the offensive began on 9 May, Petain's 33rd Corps, attacking in the crucial central sector, achieved early successes beyond expectations. In 90 minutes, his troops moved forward 2.5 miles on a 4-mile front. The 77th and Moroccan divisions reached the crest of Vimy Ridge between Souchez and La Folie Farm. Inevitably, by nightfall, the Germans had counterattacked and pushed Petain's troops off the crest. From that point on, the offensive degenerated into a bitter close-quarter struggle in the labyrinth of German strongpoints and trenches on or below the ridge. As the grisly specter of attrition reimposed itself, the French made a few extra gains, securing much of the vital neighboring spur of Notre-Dame de Lorette. On 16 June, the impressive Moroccan division again reached the top on Vimy Ridge, but as before, could not hold on to all its gains. 5 weeks of fighting had cost an additional 100,000 French casualties, while German losses totaled some 60,000. All that Joffre and Foch could show for this sacrifice was the recapture of 5 more miles of French soil and a precarious toehold on Vimy Ridge. The BEF's part in the offensive operations on 9 May was a large-scale version of its own March assault, with Haig's First Army attacking either side of Neuve-Chapelle in a fresh effort to secure Auber's Ridge. The success of the short bombardment in March was borne in mind, but the BEF's worrying shortage of heavy guns and ammunition limited the preliminary bombardment to 45 minutes. As the German defenses in this sector had strengthened since March, the bombardment was simply not heavy enough. With plenty of time to emerge from their dugouts and man their trench parapets relatively unscathed, the defenders inflicted 11,000 casualties for only tiny British gains, compelling Haig to terminate the attack early on 10 May. Between 15 and 27 May, the BEF incurred 16,000 casualties for a maximum advance of some 1,300 yards, just enough to encourage future reliance on longer artillery bombardments before infantry attacks. Elsewhere on the front, the French made an abortive attempt to eradicate the potential threat posed to the eastern flank of Verdun by the German-held Saint-Mihiel salient, incurring 64,000 casualties in the process. Another 32,000 French officers and men fell in the Argonne sector from 20 June to 14 July. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to experiment with new weapons. After first using flamethrowers near Verdun in February, they subjected the raw British 14th Division to a terrifying liquid fire attack at Hooge near Ypres on 30 July. Sir John French was swept away by the recriminations over the handling of the reserves during the disastrous Battle of Loo in September. He was succeeded as Commander-in-Chief of the BEF by Douglas Haig on 19 December. By the end of 1915, the Germans were moving away from the columns and skirmish lines of 1914 and were training special assault detachments, or storm troops, which had their own flamethrowers, light artillery, and mortars for close fire support, and advanced independently to deal with enemy strong points. In 1916, they would put them to devastating use.